Welcome to another episode of SHI's Research Breakdown, where we turn complex research into quick conversations that matter for your business. In this episode, we're reviewing Gartner's research report, Control Software, Cloud and AI Costs by Integrating ITAM and FinOps, which we featured in the August 22nd edition of the Research Roundup LinkedIn newsletter. The report identifies the potential to cut costs by 30%, a number which is very familiar to most ITAM, SAM and FinOps practitioners, as we discussed in a previous episode a couple of months ago. The good news is that the analysts believe that this cost saving is achievable within the next 2 years. Overall, the report highlights that rising software, cloud and AI costs are forcing CIOs to unify ITAM and FinOps practices to get control of their costs. I'm Victoria Barber. I head up the Strategic Insights function here at SHI. I've invited my colleagues Shane Cronin, head of ITAM and FinOps, who joined us for the earlier discussion that I mentioned, and Kevin Wade, manager of FinOps. And we're going to discuss the research in more detail given the current focus on the convergence of ITAM and FinOps. So Shane, let's start with that 30% figure that we've talked about before. Do you think this number is realistic?
Probably. It's a difficult one to answer. You and I joked last time about the fact that 30% seems to be the statistic that every year through multiple surveys comes up over and over and over again, even though tooling gets better, expertise gets better. What I would say is in the category of AI, it's clear that we haven't figured AI out. There's not a single process that is currently existing that gives organizations full visibility. We're still kind of figuring all of this out. And if you think about how AI is currently working, right, you've got consumption-based price models. There's a relatively low barrier to entry, meaning that the sprawl is probably a little bit bigger than SaaS is at this point in time. There's a lot of experimental waste. So 30% in theory is probably achievable, but it requires a lot of change.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And honestly, when it comes to AI, I would say more than 30% is probably achievable, at least in theory. In practicality, there's a lot that's going to have to be done in order to, A, have the visibility, but more importantly, be able to allocate those resources to particular workloads and products and be able to come back later and say, hey, we actually got value out of this and we should pump more money into this. Or, we've been putting a lot of money into this and we're not actually seeing anything. We should probably just go ahead and kill whatever this is and move on to the next thing that's going to make us money.
So what's driving the need for closer alignment between ITAM and FinOps right now? Why is this not something that either can be dealt with by one or the other, or that can be dealt with separately by each of them to achieve that?
It's a good question. I think you have to, first of all, look back at what the history of the two, whatever we want to call it, frameworks is, right? FinOps has obviously been more focused on cloud, and you could argue when it comes to AI is maybe more appropriate to solving that challenge, as ITAM has been probably traditionally focused more on traditional licensing and some SaaS. We're probably at an inflection point where both organizations are starting to intersect in some way. I would say we're seeing this demand more. We have seen that most organizations have set up siloed practices. And I think what there is an acknowledgement of, you could argue the KPIs for the most part are the same, right? There is a category of spend. You are trying to get control and visibility over it. You are trying to optimize it. You don't want to have any waste, and you want to ensure that those hard spent dollars are generating the result that you expect. And that honestly is the same within ITAM and FinOps, but it's procurement, it's finance, right? Across the board. Generally, this is what we're all working towards. So having different organizations, even outside of ITAM and FinOps, working on these things in silo doesn't really make sense.
No, I mean, I think 5 years from now, no longer than 10 years from now, you really won't be able to talk about FinOps, ITAM, TBM independently. They will all be the same thing. Like it's all moving towards the same combined type of practice. You'll still have individual skill sets within that practice, but it won't make sense to say this is FinOps and this is ITAM, I'd say 5 years from now. I would also say with FinOps, we look at things a little bit differently than traditional ITAM in that the spend itself is much more unpredictable and can vary widely from, say, one day or 1 week to the next, but also in terms of the time frames that you're looking at. In traditional ITAM, hearing words like quarterly and annually in terms of renewals, in FinOps, a week is a long time. I mean, you can go through quite a bit of money in a week if you're not actually addressing it. In AI, that's even more true. So with AI now able to exist both on-prem and in the cloud through various models, we have to be able to look at that spend outside of the cloud, which is not something that FinOps has traditionally done. ITAM has to be able to look at software usage in the cloud and AI usage in ways that they haven't traditionally done. If we're going to do that separately, we're going to miss things, or we are going to duplicate things. Either way, that's wasteful and it's inefficient. The best way to make that happen is to bring people together and essentially voluntold them to collaborate.
So the report described ITAM and FinOps as kindred spirits. I'm not sure about the terminology. It made me think of Anne of Green Gables, to be honest, rather than ITAM and FinOps. And being totally honest, I think all three of us have actually seen tensions there in the past, a little bit of territorial behaviour, because that convergence has meant that each of them has been looking at, is my discipline going to be absorbed or disappeared? Are we stepping on people's toes? So perhaps been a little bit of a lack of collaboration and cooperation there when there shouldn't have been. So leaving aside the whole kindred spirits thing, how are ITAM and FinOps similar, and why do we still see them operating in silos?
There's definitely a shared mission between the two. I mean, both ITAM and FinOps are trying to achieve cost optimization and value realization. So I think there's a lot in common there. Why the silos? Some of it goes back to they've evolved or developed in different eras. ITAM is a much older discipline. FinOps is a much newer discipline. I've been in FinOps now for 4 years. The discipline itself has only been around for 10-ish, a little over 10. So there's a little bit of that. Because the underlying infrastructure is different, there's a little bit of a different vocabulary that gets used. Use different tools. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is looking at like, hey, can we get a unified platform that will help us look at both FinOps and ITAM infrastructure, the kinds of reporting that we want, the kinds of dashboards that will give customers exactly what they're looking for. It's very, very difficult to find something that's going to give you that. So if you're working within a different tool set with different underlying infrastructure, from a distance, it's hard to see like, okay, how are we going to collaborate?
So actually, I mean, that brings us to the point about, people tend to look at this and go, great, I'll buy a new tool, right? I'll buy a new tool, have a nice dashboard, all my problems are going to be solved. And I know certainly in ITAM, that was a perennial issue of everybody assuming I've bought my ITAM tool and magically everything is going to be fine. And I'm guessing that there's a similar approach in FinOps. I bought tool, why isn't it all working? So what are the kind of skills and roles that we need to make this work? And also, is that changing as we look at integration?
So I want to talk about the tool thing first and then get into the skills and the roles. One of the most common themes that came out of FinOps X both last year and this year is that the vast majority of customers are using an average of 3 to 4 FinOps tools to do FinOps visibility reporting, show back, charge back, forecasting, so on and so forth. That is not looking at what are they using to tackle ITAM, on-prem, licensing, SaaS. That's just the cloud piece, and in some cases includes the SaaS piece. The other thing that came out of that is they are building up all of those structures and tearing them down and starting over every, say, 3 or 4 years. So there is not one tool that works just for FinOps for most customers. And even if it does work, it may work now and you're going to have to start over. So once you add in, I want something that does both FinOps and ITAM, you are going to increase that complexity and difficulty exponentially.
I mean, at the end of the day, I know we joke about it a lot, but the tools have obviously gotten better. They've become more advanced. The native tooling that's provided is years better, right? And the problem still persists because the topic itself is complicated. So vendors change their rules. You have the introduction of new type of compliance through AI, SaaS sprawl. Even the reseller landscape is changing, right? So where organizations may have gone to a reseller before for certain expertise, like maybe that's not being provided anymore due to changes in the market. It's fundamentally still a governance and a people issue because the tooling is getting better. So is somebody accountable for this? That's the fundamental question that I think we have to be asking most organizations because, even if you hire all the services providers in the world and get all the tools and create the best dashboards, is someone going to take action on the recommendation? Because if not, it's pointless.
Because you can't outsource accountability, and a service
Correct.
provider can make recommendations but can't actually make the business decision as to what you do because it doesn't have visibility of all of the business implications. And ultimately, a business decision needs to be made by the business.
Absolutely. And to that, these skill sets are really hard to find, and no organization, particularly complex ones, is able to afford that many people, right? You've got a category of strategic spend. So an organization can't hire someone who's deep in expertise on Oracle, IBM, SAP, Microsoft, Salesforce, ServiceNow. The list goes on. Then you need somebody who has cloud expertise. Now we're probably in an area where you need somebody who has a common understanding of both, because those two discussions need to be married into one when you're working with those vendors. You have tail spend.
So if organizations are looking at starting to connect ITAM and FinOps, it sounds like, Kevin, they really need to start with enabling that communication and that common understanding, and in order for people to be able to work together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that needs to happen. I also think unless you have some really gifted folks who are like, hey, let me go way outside of my comfort zone. Let me do some things that could even be like career risky. I'm a manager of a team, and then there's a manager of an ITAM team. Let's go suggest that we combine teams. Well, is there going to be room for two leaders in that situation? Like, is there going to be right sizing of staff? Like, are we going to need all of these people? So unless you have that, then you're going to have somebody in leadership who goes, hey, we're going to put these things together. And here's why. This is what we're going to get out of this. So you're going to need a charter, a mandate of this is why we're going to do this. And this is the intent. This is what we need to get out of it. So at least in some semblance, what good looks like. And then from there, you can start to figure out, okay, what do we need to be able to accomplish? What do we need access to? What visibility are we looking for? How are we going to do that? And then you can start figuring out like who are the right people to be doing this. And then let's define processes.
And I think what we're really seeing now is, and this research and the other research that we're seeing is suggesting that actually this is no longer optional. We've been able to get away without doing that integration for a while, but where the gap is between the two, that gap is becoming more important. There's more in there. And so if we don't do this, our SaaS costs are going to spiral, our cloud costs are going to spiral, and our AI adoption costs are definitely going to spiral. So really, IT leaders do need to start really looking at ITAM and FinOps and say these are complementary disciplines. We have to build that unified skilled practice, whether it's a single organization or some kind of matrix function, but there has to be that governance for them to work together.
But I mean, at this point, you've got more research highlighting the importance of it, right, from the analyst community. On top of that, you've got a strategic partnership that was announced between the ITAM Forum and the FinOps Foundation maybe 4 or 5 months ago. Kevin and I work closely with the FinOps Foundation today, and he was on some group today talking about this as a topic. So it's clearly something that the broader community is focused on. So I think anyone listening to this who is part of those organizations and thinking about like it's happening. So there's sort of an opportunity to frame that and think about that now rather than get caught up on it once it's already been defined for you.
Well, and I'll say that, part of the working group conversation this morning, because there was a FinOps X day where this was a topic, like they actually had a chalk talk on this, but it was also one of the things that came up in the keynote. And about a quarter of the crowd in the keynote who kind of responded to a hands up request had indicated that they were combining or had combined their teams. And based on the feedback from the person who was running the chalk talk, it seems like it's the larger companies that are doing this. And imagine if you can achieve that 30% of savings by combining and really starting to collaborate, imagine what's going to happen if you don't do that and your competitors are. I mean, 30%, that is a big gap to try and overcome just because you have a superior product.
And think of all the fun things you could be spending that 30% saving on instead.
Right.
So thank you both so much for joining us today and sharing your insights with us. And thank you to our listeners for joining too. You can find more episodes of the Research Breakdown wherever you get your podcasts, and you can sign up for the Research Roundup on SHI's LinkedIn page. In addition, for a limited period, you can obtain a complimentary copy of the Gartner report that we've been discussing via the link in the show notes. SHI Media, you heard it here.